Comrade Joe Biden. Welcome to the Georgia Ramble, a new section of the Rorschach Update. Every now and then we'll release a special episode that includes a more or less unedited conversation with a guest, discussion about whatever pops into our heads and is relevant to Georgia. Thank you for joining us. This is the Rorschach Ramble, number 3 for Georgia. We have a weekly update in English on what's going on in Georgia. But this one, we've got guests, Masho and Ted. I will let them introduce themselves in a second. I want to say we hope that you will subscribe to the Rorschach Georgia update to find out what's going on, because if you've been hiding under a rock for the last year or so, you may not know that now is an unbelievably exciting time in Georgia. We'll tell you what's happening there. So first, Masho, if you can say a few words about who you are, and then Ted, if you can introduce yourselves briefly.
Sure. Hi, Mark. First of all, thank you for the invitation. So briefly about myself, I'm a freelance journalist based in Tbilisi, Georgia. I cover Georgia for international media, and I mostly concentrate on disinformation, the way authoritarian leaders are using new technologies, and also Georgia foreign affairs, especially relating to Russia. That's briefly my background.
Hi, Mark. Hi, Masho. I'm Ted Jonas. I am a dual U.S. and Georgian citizen. I'm a lawyer. And I've spent about 30 years in Georgia working on business law. And also I opened the National Democratic Institute office here back in 1994. But the short version is I'm a business lawyer, and I do environmental defense work as well.
Fantastic. Thank you both very much. So now we will have a lengthy sweep through the grand scope of Georgian history as background, which started with Ziad Gamzahordia. Shevardnadze took over from him. Then there was the Rose Revolution in 2003, and Misha et al. Took over from him. That seems to be an event that looms large in the mind of the current ruling party, which is Georgian Dream, or in Georgian Otsneba. The national movement that was run by Misha Saakashvili was then voted out of power in 2012, and then in 2013, Misha lost the presidential election, and Otsneba began its rule. Various ways to see how that has gone, but things have gotten quite intense, particularly a year ago when they put forward what's known as a foreign agents law, which was started around 10 years ago in Russia, and is a law that is used in order to shut down NGOs and media under the pretext of transparency. There were demonstrations last March for this law, which came to be known as the Russian law, and Otsneba backed off. Been busy bees in the last year with lots of comms and research and honing their message to bring it back again in anticipation of the October 26th parliamentary elections that are going to be very, very hotly contested. And they have brought back the law in order to be able to shut down critics in preparation for that election. So I want to start out asking Masho, and we're going to talk about sort of the mood on the street and what's going on there a little bit later, but just in terms of background, about the messaging of Otsneba and what they are saying about this law. You hear lots and lots of referring to the global war party. What is that? There's a lot of talk about transparency, unusual considering Bidzina Ivanishvili's background, the gazillionaire, billionaire that runs things. So I'm just wondering if you can give us, what is the ruling party saying about this law, and how are they trying to portray it?
What the reasoning has been behind this law, according to the government, is that we have an influx of international funding coming into Georgia with the aims of basically starting a second front in Georgia. So there's this idea that there is this global war party, according to the Georgian Dream, and especially Bidzina Ivanishvili, which exists somewhere in the US and also in European Union. According to them, European Union especially is very diverse, and there is a big group of people who are directly advocating to start a war in Georgia, for Russia to invade Georgia. So what the government has been saying is that they need this law in order to understand how the foreign funding is used in Georgia, and how basically this foreign funding is supposedly fueling radicalism among the youth especially. So that's kind of been the overall messaging from the Otsneba side. And of course, the main tagline that they have is transparency is European and there is nothing wrong with transparency. And I guess that would be the brief explanation.
Does anybody, well, I mean, probably some people believe them. Hopefully not too many, because it's such extraordinary bullshit.
Absolutely.
But but maybe some people do. And so the people who believe them, who believes them? Who is listening to them, and how and why does it resonate with them is your guess, and how has that changed over the sort of weeks of demonstrations most recently?
Okay, so who believes them? I mean, that's harder. It's easier to say who supports Georgian Dream because we know they have incredible numbers of public administration workers, and we know that they've been misusing the administrative funds. So those would be the ones who vote for the government. But in terms of who believes them, I think it's people who are quite susceptible to propaganda, and this is probably people over 60 years old who don't speak English, for example. They only speak Russian, and therefore they only listen to Georgian and Russian outlets. Those are probably people who believe this narrative the most. And I think we need to understand a bit of earlier context. The idea, so Georgian Dream and the rhetoric has been concentrated on the idea that somehow Georgian Dream is a safeguard of peace in Georgia. So in case they leave and let's say UNM, Saakashvili's party comes back, then the war with Russia is going to start. And basically, in order to support this idea, they've expanded on the rhetoric to say that it's not just Saakashvili who's trying to get back to power to start the war with Russia. It's actually EU who's helping him to do that. And it's the global war parties faction of EU that's supposedly helping Saakashvili to open the second front. So yeah, I would say people about 60 who watch TV and have very limited sources of information are most susceptible to this propaganda.
Interesting. Okay, so it seems to be Bidzina Ivanishvili, who is, the billionaire that controls the party, seems to be the main advocate of this, and certainly heavily in charge. And being a billionaire makes that easier than it would otherwise be. Tedo, can you tell us a little bit about him, his background, where he came from, having been a lawyer and sort of having some idea of what he's been doing? I think he came to Georgia right before the revolution, which was only, remember, a couple of years after Putin came in as president of Russia. After the FSB blew up a bunch of apartment buildings and blamed it on the Chechens. It was a time that was becoming uncomfortable for non-ethnic Russians to be in Georgia, particularly those with considerable assets. And he was sort of looking around for a place to go, and began to sort of hang around in Georgia, even though at that time, if you remember, there were no sort of pictures of him. Nobody really knew much about him. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of his story and how he ended up in politics and where that's gone?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. There's never been really very much public information in English, and I myself don't know Russian, about how Ivanishvili made his money in Russia in the 90s. The things I've heard are banking, mining, pharmaceuticals, those kinds of things. I've always been interested in urban preservation and environmental matters, and I've always lived in the part of Tbilisi near the botanical gardens, which is where Ivanishvili has chosen to build many of his personal monuments against zoning laws and against laws that protect green space. He began, as far as I know, he got the rights to build his big house, which used land inside the botanical gardens, which are a national monument, during the Shevardnadze government, in the late years of the Shevardnadze government in the early 2000s. And Shevardnadze, as well as Misha Saakashvili, rolled out the red carpet for Bidzina Ivanishvili because he sounded like a patriot. He said he supported Georgia, and he was a billionaire. So they saw benefit to the country in encouraging him to settle here. And this was as true of Misha Saakashvili's government from 2003, 2004, as it was of Shevardnadze's government. Misha, in fact, legalized Ivanishvili's ownership of these extraordinary properties that he'd been able to use his money to get a hold of. And you will remember, Mark, probably that in the early years of the Saakashvili government, Ivanishvili was actually paying the government, was giving money to the Georgian government for uniforms for the military and a number of other things. But over time, and explicitly by 2011, Ivanishvili became an opponent of the Saakashvili government. Did Ivanishvili arrive here in Georgia in 2002 from Russia with all his money, intending to subvert the government, take control, and be essentially the Russian plant here to run the country? It's impossible to say. None of this is transparent. I think the current situation is that the Russians do issue orders to Bidzina. I believe that the reintroduction of the Russian law was an order. I think that just as the Russians told Yanukovych in 2013 that Ukraine should stop its European direction and not sign the EU association agreement, I believe that that final order has come down to the Georgian Dream government, and that's why we've seen this extreme turn, which began 3 years ago, I would say, explicit turn away from the West, but is now very explicit. But at the same time, I think it's a mutually beneficial or complementary relationship. The Russians have their foreign policy objectives. They want Georgia to be in their orbit. Bidzina is a guy with a lot of money who wants to be the Grand Duke of Georgia. The last thing Bidzina Ivanishvili wants is European democracy and rule of law, which would bring scrutiny and transparency to the control he exercises over the Georgian government and to his wealth, where it comes from and how it's used. So I really think that this global war party thing comes out of his crazy conspiracy theory about why Credit Suisse froze his money. So anyway, just the upshot of all that is that, yes, I think the Russians issue instructions to him. I think he implements them in the way that suits and that is peculiarly Bidzina Ivanishvili.
Interesting. I've always sort of felt like Ivanishvili, his goals for Georgia is just for Georgia to be his retirement country. He just wants to stay peacefully in Georgia forever. And that requires that Georgia not be democratic and that the Georgian people, not have the ability through elections to get another administration. And that also happens to pair quite nicely with the Kremlin's goals for Georgia, which is that it not be democratic and do as it is told so that he can, live out his life in Georgia and, move trees and I don't know, do whatever he
exactly.
wants to do.
And I would actually, sorry to interrupt you, but I would say it's not just to live out. He literally, it's a feudalistic system. I think that his kind of rule is like as a feudal lord, all these people are his vassals in effect that run the government. He sees it as his feudal estate and he treats the country as his feudal estate. I mean, one thing that's very notable is how little foreign investment there has been in Georgia in the last few years. He doesn't want foreign investment, and he particularly does not want EU and US foreign investment, which brings with it requirements for rule of law and transparency. He wants to control the Georgian economy. He wants it to be under his, network, basically.
So moving forward a bit, the trajectory, I mean, it's in terms of the demonstrations, certainly people have been making it very, very clear. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but Saturday night, that demonstration, which from what I've read, and, it's hard to know with the numbers, but, it looked like it was very, very comfortably close to or over 100, 200,000 people. It was the biggest demonstrations in Georgian history and, bigger than anything during the Rose Revolution. And it's just very, very clear that there are a large number of people that are against this law because, they know operationally what it'll be used for. What I'm wondering is and I've never been able to figure it out if it's 82 or 83, but the Otsneba members of parliament, is anybody talking to them? They're sort of close friends and brothers and sisters and saying to them, you really need to reassess where you're sitting on this. I mean, is it just money or what is, what's going on with conversations for members of parliament and senior Otsneba figures related to this? Are they all just deluding each other and actually believe this stuff or, what's the story there? Masho, do you have any insight into this?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite hard to tell what their motivations are. It seems like money is a big part of it to an extent, I think. So it might be a similar system as in Russia, whereas there is a whole system of blackmail built in, whereas they've done a lot of corruption and there's a lot of evidence for every Georgian Dream member for all of their wrongdoings. And it seems like if they're going to go against the collective party decision, that they're going to be faced with consequences. In terms of if you watch their rhetoric, I mean, it doesn't really seem like they've been big believers of this, or if the fact that they're talking honestly, because all of their messaging is very much identical to each other and the messaging changes every day. And it seems like everyone is just reading like the message box that they have available to them. So I guess it's money, it's blackmail. And at the same time, I think when people do wrong things for money, they need to justify it for themselves to sleep well at night. So I think to an extent, maybe some of them have convinced themselves that this is somehow a good course for Georgia overall. This would be my opinion. Again, I don't have too much information from what's happening inside, but this seems like what's happening.
I think that was an excellent summary, and I would agree with it 100%. Bizina has a long history of using blackmail, which is obvious. The money is less seen, but I would have said exactly the same thing. It's money, it's blackmail, and then it's people who've accepted money or been blackmailed, then convince themselves that what they're doing is justified.
So it's we're back to compromise. I mean, it's just, back in the old days in Shevardnadze's time, when I was, floating around, I moved to Georgia a couple of years after Ted. And I remember that time when any job that would allow you to get bribes, you had to pay a certain amount of money to get that. But also they needed to have some compromise on you so that if you showed disloyalty by, for example, exposing the bribery inherent in the system, they would be able to prosecute you or somehow, embarrass you or something like that. So we're more or less in that situation again, which is sad to hear.
Mark, if I could add one thing in terms of blackmail, this is kind of a confirmed thing in a sense that, for example, if you remember, there were two cases already when two women party members of Georgian Dream went against the collective decision of the party, and they were faced with the blackmail of them having sex on video somehow. So we know that the blackmail exists on Georgian Dream members. I can explain those cases. The last one was, for example, Eka Beselia, who was in charge of, she was dealing with the judiciary side of European Union integration. And when she said that the reforms that they were supposed to push through were not happening, and she kind of went against the party lines, this was the consequence that she faced. There was a sex tape of her that came out, and she left the Georgian Dream afterwards. So I think there's not really a question that blackmails exist.
Right. And the case I'm familiar with, and Masha, this is probably one of the other ones you were thinking of, was Maya
Panjikidze one. Yeah.
Panjikidze, who was a former foreign minister in the Saakashvili government, ambassador, very respected diplomat who had joined the Georgian Dream and then went into the opposition against them with the sort of when the liberal faction of the Georgian Dream started to break off around 2016, and they ruined her career with sex tapes.
Wow, that's very depressing to hear. Now, what about communication with the sort of, let's call them the TV Georgians, older people, monolingual people, or people who only speak Georgian and Russian? I've heard of, a new group, Daltoid, that interesting group. But what are the mechanisms of trying to persuade those that may not have access to the English language internet or outside information? What are efforts to communicate with them about what's happening?
I would say the main mechanism to persuade these people to vote for Georgian Dream and go along with their policies, the main one is, of course, fear. I would say kind of the most important one and the most used one is basically using fear to control the masses. And the fear rests on the idea, again, as I mentioned, the theory goes that if Georgian Dream leaves the government, then Saakashvili is going to come and the war is going to start with Russia. It's like the logic behind it, according to them, is very simple. There was a war in 2008 while Saakashvili was the president. So this means that if Saakashvili comes back, there's going to be another war. And Putin hates Misha. So for sure, if he's going to come back, they're going to attack. And being scared of Russia is kind of part of Georgian DNA, right? Most of the generations who are still alive have seen a war with Russia. They've seen a war in the 90s. They've seen a war in 2008. So it's quite natural for people to fear the attacks from the Russian side. And this idea of provoking Russia is quite real in people's heads. It's quite complicated to understand that the global context changes, and the way it changes, it's hard to follow. So what was happening in 2008 is not really the reality that's standing right now. And we know that especially EU and US have kind of woken up to what Russia is planning to do and what it has been doing so far. But understanding this context requires like basic knowledge of politics, and especially international politics, which is not widely available in Georgia. There's not really a big part of Georgian education, definitely was not part of Georgian education during the Soviet time. So I would say this fear is probably the main line that they're using. Yeah, I guess that would be my answer. And yeah, at the same time, it's this also playing on the idea of like traditional values. Georgia, as you know, is quite a conservative society, full of people who are very deep believers in Orthodox Christianity, and manipulating people with the idea that somehow EU is going after our religion and traditions is quite effective. And at the same time, this is the rhetoric that they're employing, but it's also interesting to watch what are the type of people who are spreading the rhetoric. There have been documented cases where, for example, local priests have been preaching to vote for Georgian Dream in their churches. There has been also cases where a local, I would not say gangsters, but I would say people who are involved in not so illegal activities are also spreading the idea that if the Georgian dream is going to lose, then Saakashvili is going to come back, and this means the war is going to start. And on top of that, for past 12 years, Georgian dream has been using the idea that basically Saakashvili was the worst thing that ever happened to Georgia. It was the bloodiest dictator we ever had. Basically, their narrative really rests on the idea that Misha is going to come, the war is going to start, and Misha is going to start arresting everyone again and start beating people up, and it's going to get more violent. So I would say those are two main lines.
Interesting. That's helpful. One, sort of domestically, I mean, I think my own opinion looking forward on this is that the law is designed to be operationally useful to the ruling party. I mean, they will fine NGOs and media, and then if those are not adhered to, begin criminal proceedings, and it'll be a way to, actually really pretty effectively silence the, media outlets and NGOs, which will be useful for them, all under the umbrella of, you're just scared of transparency or something like that. One of the questions is, what should the international community be doing right now? Ted, what are your thoughts about that on sanctions or anything else? For those listening in English, what should people be paying attention to, and what should the democratic world be thinking about in terms of helping those who want a sovereign, independent, democratic Georgia as a member of the EU? What should they be doing?
Well, the first thing that I'll say, I'm as a lawyer, is that sanctions can only be issued when there is a legal basis for the sanctions according to the law of the sanctioning state or organization. If there are legal grounds under U.S. law for the issuance of sanctions against certain Georgian individuals like Ivanishvili and like people in his business circle, then it should be done. And in the absence of that basis, of course, it should not be done. These things, they shouldn't be seen as being entirely politicized. The fact is that now, for the last 3 years, since the Georgian government became so anti-Western and anti-EU, so openly anti-Western and anti-EU, the US and the EU have taken the approach of, let's not alienate them with punishing words. Let's not alienate them with punishments. Let's use the carrot more than the stick and try to keep them on board so they don't go even further towards the Kremlin. That's not worked, unfortunately. I mean, I wish it had, but that has not worked. And Bidzina's speech to the public 2 weeks ago showed that it was a full-throated turn from the West, an anti-Western speech. So it is really by the criteria of the U.S. government, by the criteria of the EU, it is now time to use the stick, so to speak, instead of the carrot, the punishing mechanisms. My own recommendation, for whatever it's worth, which is not much, would be that they would begin by sanctioning people in his business circle, in Bidzina's business circle. There are definitely people in Bidzina's business and family circle who I suspect can be sanctioned for illegal financial activities, illegal business activities with Russia, possibly also some of the politicians who've been responsible for some of the worst rhetoric and some of the worst actions. Once you actually sanction Bidzina, then you've lost the leverage of the threat. So of a sanction. So I would, if I were making the decisions here, I would close the noose basically around him by sanctioning people around him. The purpose of that is that it will increasingly weaken this government. And if there's any hope of getting this government to compromise or to moderate its position so that there's at least some modus vivendi, some way of living that gets us to the elections, then that's a good thing. So the upshot being is I think that the US and the EU need to start using the hard tools like sanctions. I think also it would be very valuable for the US to revoke entry rights and visa rights for members of the Georgian Dream government.
Great. Okay, thanks. Thanks for that, Ted. Look, just to finish up, like a minute or two, each of you have been physically defending democratic Georgia with some consequences recently. But Masho, can you talk a little bit about how it feels on the street there? Just the mood.
Yeah. So the mood on the street. I mean, the protest has been going on for a month now, which is quite fascinating. And this was not honestly the expectation that I had. And it seems like crowd is not really, it's still a really big size of people who come out. People don't seem like they're up for giving up. But the problem and also the blessing that this protest had is that it's a very decentralized protest, meaning that there's certainly not one leader leading this. There's not even just one organization or a group of people who are leading this. It's extremely decentralized. There are different student movements, NGOs, social movements behind this. So this is great for many reasons. It's great for democracy. It's great for government not being able to kind of go after certain individuals and finish the protest. But at the same time, there is some complaints about the lack of proper organization, which I think unless that improves, it's going to have a negative effect on the protest. I think we're reaching the point now that they've accepted the law and it has been passed through. And now we kind of have to rethink what the action plan is. I'm quite hopeful, but we'll see.
Great. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Ted. A couple of words on the word on the street, your own personal activity.
Yeah. Well, as even the New York Times has broadcast today, I was beaten up by special Spetsnaz police and RoboCops about 2 weeks ago, quite badly beaten. I'm pursuing the standard legal processes for redress of that, as are many other people. Mood on the street is that people are coming to hate the government for its violence, and people are acting on what is a fundamental principle. And the difference between this moment and prior moments is that the issue is absolutely black and white, one or the other. It's the West or not the West. And Georgians are coming out to support the long, long history in this country. Really, I put it back 2,000 years to the Roman Empire for this country to be connected to the West. And so I believe that the Georgian Dream made a profound mistake and mobilized the population, a majority of the population, against them.
I agree.
Okay. Thank you for that. That's a great note to wrap up on. I think we'll do another one soon, hopefully with these two. This has been delightful. And the next one, we'll start talking specifically about the elections. And I really, really appreciate your time and your focus and attention to save the Samshoblo. So Masho and Ted, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark.
My pleasure.
Thank you for joining. If you have any ideas or suggestions of what to do in an upcoming Georgia Ramble, anybody you want to hear from, what we should talk about, anything you're curious about, topics otherwise, let us know. Send us an email at georgia@rorschach.com. That's RORSHOK.com. Thanks. Nachandis.